The clay roads of southern Alabama hold stories the way pine bark holds scars, layered, quiet, and permanent. On an April evening in 1978, the air in one small county was thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass and bay water. A spring night so ordinary it should have disappeared into memory like all the others. But instead, it hardened into legend. At 7:15 p.m., 18-year-old Stephen Michael Johnson pedaled past a white mailbox at the corner of Old Shell Road. The woman watering her tomato plants lifted her hand to wave. Stephen waved back, just as he always did. The light caught the handlebars, the metallic blue frame, and the equipment bag strapped to the basket. A fleeting sight, the kind neighbors remember for the smallest reasons. It was the last time anyone in town saw him alive. By 11:47 that night, Stephen's bicycle lay twisted in a roadside ditch, the front wheel bent, the white handlebar tape stained dark, where the flashlight beam of his father revealed something that looked like blood. Nearby in the grass were his glove and a pair of cleats. Sacred objects for a boy who measured time by innings and strike counts rested like relics no one was meant to find. The field where his team waited remained untouched, lights glowing above an empty diamond, a space carved out for a pitcher who never arrived. What began as a routine ride to practice would unravel into a mystery that haunted the county for nearly 4 decades. The initial investigation struggled under the weight of limitation. Deputies scribbled the wrong hair color into reports. Evidence was stored in brown grocery sacks. Photographs, washed out and blurry, showed shadows rather than truths. Neighbors scoured the woods with flashlights, trampling through whatever signs had been left. Stephen's parents spent the night in the sheriff's office lobby, pressing a school portrait into tired hands, insisting their son had never run away, never strayed beyond the perimeter of responsibility. Yet the logbook carried the entry forward as if he were a runaway, another teenager lost in the humid dark. Weeks passed, then months. Theories spread like heat through summer air. Some whispered Stephen had fled, overwhelmed by expectations. Others said a car had clipped him and carried him off the road, the driver too frightened to stop. Darker voices suggested debts, disputes, or predatory secrets. Each story filled the vacuum left by silence. The only certainty was absence. His mother made flyers, 3,000 in the first year, tacked to telephone poles and grocery store boards across 3 states. His father drove back roads night after night, headlights cutting through pines, searching for tire tracks or disturbed earth. Their grief became ritual, a life reorganized around not knowing. The case slipped into the backlog of unsolved files, each folder heavier with dust than with answers. And yet, time did not bury it completely. The bicycle, the glove, and the cleats. These objects lived on as evidence, boxed and mislabeled, carried forward across administrations that changed uniforms but never solved the riddle. Families learn to live with absence, but they do not forgive it. For decades, Stephen's mother sat across from sheriffs and detectives, her voice steady, her questions exact. Where was her son? Why did the scene suggest a story no one could finish telling? It would take 37 years and an accident of construction to unearth the truth. In the fall of 2015, an excavator widening Highway 45 cut through clay soil that had once been disturbed by human hands. The operator saw blue fabric first, then bone. The site froze into silence as the crew stepped back, realizing they had uncovered a grave that did not belong to history books, but to their own county's unfinished past. Within hours, yellow tape circled the site, investigators marking fragments, clothing, a wallet too decomposed to open, and a class ring with initials etched into its band. The earth, long a keeper of secrets, had finally spoken. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the investigation had a body. Forensic science had advanced beyond what anyone in 1978 could imagine. DNA could be coaxed from fragments, and stories whispered from hair roots and fibers. where old photographs blurred, new microscopes clarified. And from that grave, an answer began to take shape, not just about who had died, but about who had lived among them carrying a secret. The eventual arrest would stun the community, not because evil had come from elsewhere, but because it had been hiding in plain sight. Stay with us as we unravel this haunting story, from that spring evening in 1978 to the courtroom where a confession broke decades of silence. And if you're drawn to mysteries that span lifetimes and prove that truth, however delayed, will not stay buried, make sure you're subscribed, because the story that begins with Stephen Michael Johnson on a bicycle is not just about the night he vanished. It is about how a community learned that the past does not forgive, and that justice sometimes waits in the dark for decades before it steps into the light. By dawn on the 16th of April 1978, the Johnson household had already become a command post for fear. Margaret Johnson sat at the kitchen table, her son's untouched plate of fried chicken still on the counter from the night before, her hands folded over a photograph she had pressed into the sheriff's hands only hours earlier. Thomas Johnson paced the length of the living room, back and forth, as if his movement might keep the silence from collapsing in on them. Their son, 18-year-old Stephen Michael Johnson, had never missed a baseball practice and had never stayed away from home without a call. Something was wrong, and every passing hour deepened the dread. The sheriff's department opened the case as a missing person report, a line in a logbook that looked no different from others. Deputy Francis Lombardi, who had been on duty when the bicycle was found, filed it as a possible runaway, possible accident. His language was cautious, hedged by uncertainty. But for the Johnson family, uncertainty was unbearable. Margaret pressed her point to anyone who would listen. My boy would never just leave. He had a game to pitch. He had a future waiting for him. Those words became a refrain she would repeat for years, almost liturgical in their rhythm. That morning, volunteers gathered quickly, the way small towns do when one of their own is missing. Members of the Murphy High baseball team arrived, still wearing their letter jackets, cleats strung around their necks like pendants. Teachers brought coffee in thermoses. Neighbors came with flashlights, hunting dogs, and maps. The Johnsons' driveway filled with cars, their front porch with voices promising help. The first organized search covered wooded areas near Highway 45, fanning out along creeks and pastures, through thick stands of pine where shadows lingered even in the morning light. Men shouted Stephen's name into the trees, their voices swallowed by the damp air. At the site where Stephen's bicycle had been found, investigators marked the ditch with yellow tape. The bicycle itself had already been lifted by Coach Henderson, who had moved it instinctively to check for damage. Stephen's cleats and glove had been gathered up by Thomas, who could not bear to leave them in the grass. To a father, they were not evidence, but sacred artifacts. Unfortunately, those early acts of love destroyed what little crime scene integrity might have existed. Footprints blurred into each other. Potential tire tracks vanished under the boots of volunteers. Even the stains on the handlebar tape were ignored as incidental, perhaps grease, perhaps rust. In an era before DNA analysis, the importance of biological material was not fully understood. Detective Raymond Torres, the department's most experienced investigator, took over by the third day. He was methodical, known for keeping careful notes in a small black ledger he carried everywhere. He began reconstructing Stephen's last known movements, interviewing witnesses along the route between Cottage Hill Road and Murphy High. Mrs. Dorothy Schmidt swore she had seen him at 7:15, pedaling past her mailbox, his posture upright, determined. Carl Dubois, coming home from his shift at the paper mill, recalled passing Stephen on Old Shell Road, noting how focused the boy looked, as if visualizing each pitch he would throw that night. The timeline was solid until 7:30, then dissolved into uncertainty. The baseball field itself became a kind of shrine. On the night Stephen failed to appear, the team had waited, uneasy but hopeful. until the coach finally called the sheriff's office. The diamond's infield dirt, raked smooth, remained untouched, waiting for the boy who had always been first on the mound. Players recalled staring at the empty access road, expecting at any moment to see Steven jogging in, equipment bag slung over his shoulder, ready to apologize for being late. That moment never came. In later years, survivors of that team would say they still saw him there when they looked at the field, as if his absence had carved a permanent outline into the game. The Johnson family's ordeal deepened with each fruitless day. Margaret began typing flyers on her Smith Corona typewriter, using Steven's senior portrait, smiling, green-eyed, and wearing his letter jacket. She copied 500 at a Kinko's in Mobile, then drove the county with a roll of tape, pinning his face to every bulletin board and telephone pole she could find. Each flyer bore the same simple plea. Any information, no matter how small, could help bring Steven home. She walked for hours in low heels, stopping strangers, telling them about her son's fastball, his dreams of playing college ball, and his habit of whistling on his bike rides. For Margaret, keeping him alive in people's minds was as vital as breathing. Thomas coped differently. He grew quieter, retreating into solitary searches. After long days at the shipyard, he drove back roads with a flashlight across the passenger seat, scanning ditches, culverts, and abandoned barns. He logged mileage and weather conditions in a notebook, convinced that somewhere in the ordinary landscape lay a clue. His silence was heavy, not with indifference, but with grief that had no language. Together, Margaret's relentless outreach and Thomas's private searching formed two halves of a desperate whole. The sheriff's office, meanwhile, struggled. With fewer than 40 sworn officers covering hundreds of square miles, resources were scarce. The FBI was contacted, but declined to intervene, citing insufficient evidence of abduction. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation offered technical advice but little else. Forensic testing was rudimentary. The glove, the cleats, and the bicycle all sat in storage under less than ideal conditions. Notes from that time show more guesses than conclusions. Possible vehicle accident, possible voluntary disappearance, unknown foul play. For the Johnsons, each word possible was another wound, another way of saying no one knew. Rumors filled the vacuum. Some said Steven had run off to chase a secret romance. Others whispered about gambling debts at a pool hall, or darker speculations about who he was and wasn't. Margaret bristled at these theories. My boy didn't leave. My boy didn't run. Someone took him, she told a reporter from the Mobile Register. But the community, caught between denial and dread, clung to whatever explanations made life bearable, because the alternative, that an ordinary boy on an ordinary night could simply vanish, was too terrifying to face. By the end of May 1978, the official search had slowed. Volunteers returned to work, fields needed planting, and lives pressed forward. For the Johnsons, time had stopped. The last sight of their son Steven, waving at a neighbor's mailbox, pedaling toward practice, became a loop they could not escape. The unresolved story hung over the county like the thick Alabama humidity, invisible but inescapable, waiting for an answer that would not come for 37 long years. By midsummer of 1978, the search for Steven Michael Johnson had shifted from organized urgency to a quieter, more desperate persistence. The first wave of volunteers had returned to their routines, but the absence lingered like humidity in the Alabama air, heavy and inescapable. The baseball season pressed on, without its star pitcher, the Murphy High Panthers carrying Steven's number on their sleeves, holding a moment of silence before every game. Yet each cheer from the stands carried a hollow echo, the sound of a community honoring someone who should have been on the field but instead had become a question without an answer. Margaret Johnson refused to let the case fade into routine. Her days began at 5:30 a.m. with neat stacks of flyers, her hair fixed just enough to appear respectable as she knocked on doors, stood outside grocery stores, and approached strangers with Stephen's photograph. She spoke of his fastball, his habit of whistling while riding his bike, and his dream of earning a scholarship to Auburn or Alabama. Her voice carried both persuasion and pain, and her eyes held people in place until they promised to look carefully, to remember, and to call if anything came to mind. Some listened, some avoided her, but Margaret persisted, because stopping would mean admitting Stephen was gone. Thomas grieved in silence. After 12-hour shifts at the shipyard, he drove back roads in the dark, headlights sweeping across fields, ditches, and abandoned buildings. He carried a flashlight on the passenger seat and a spiral notebook where he logged times, weather, and places checked. Sometimes he parked by the roadside, engine idling, and stared out into the woods as if sheer will might conjure the truth. His co-workers noticed he no longer lingered for coffee breaks or football arguments. Instead, he sat apart, newspaper open but unread, eyes fixed on the southern horizon as if it held an answer. Detective Raymond Torres worked the file as best he could with limited tools. He interviewed Mrs. Schmidt again, pressing her for details about Stephen's wave at 7:15 p.m., and followed up with Carl Dubois about the way Stephen rode, with such determined posture. He spoke with teammates, teachers, and neighbors. The same picture emerged. Stephen was responsible, dependable, and unlikely to vanish voluntarily. But without new evidence, every interview circled back to the same unsolved gap between 7:30, when Stephen should have been nearing the school, and 8, when the field lights glared down on an empty diamond. Rumors filled the vacuum left by the stalled investigation. In the beauty salons of Mobile County, women whispered that Stephen might have run away with a girlfriend, too ashamed to tell his parents. At the paper mill lunch tables, men speculated about debts from a pool hall, muttering that a boy gets in with the wrong people and things happen. Others whispered darker theories, picking apart his absence from dating life and his devotion to baseball, as if character flaws could explain abduction. Each rumor carried more about the fears and prejudices of the community than about Stephen himself, yet they spread like wildfire, each new retelling eroding the clarity of facts. For Margaret, these whispers were unbearable. She clenched her jaw when someone suggested that Stephen had probably just needed space. She smiled tightly when others assured her he was fine somewhere. At night, alone in Stephen's room, she let herself weep in silence. His posters of Nolan Ryan and Hank Aaron still hung on the walls. His glove still smelled of leather oil. His bed still carried the indentation of his body. Margaret could not reconcile that life, so present in the objects around her, with the rumors that sought to rewrite him into someone else. The sheriff's department, overwhelmed with routine crime, began to shift attention elsewhere. Burglaries, assaults, and domestic disturbances filled their calendars, and Stephen's case became one file among many. Torres pushed back, keeping the case active with interviews and tip follow-ups, but even his notes showed fatigue. By August, he wrote, "No new leads, search exhausted." For Margaret, this was not acceptable. She filled her own file cabinets with maps pinned with red dots, handwritten accounts of supposed sightings, and notes from conversations with truck stop waitresses, bus drivers, and gas station attendants. She called them her Stephen files, and they multiplied across the house until every surface seemed to hold paper and ink rather than photographs of the boy she longed to see. Community support, once overwhelming, thinned with time. At first, church groups brought casseroles, neighbors cut the lawn, and teachers called to check on the Johnsons. But as weeks became months, the rhythm slowed. People had to work and had to move forward. For Margaret, each casserole dish returned empty was another reminder that people were adjusting to a world without Stephen. For her, there was no adjustment, only an endless search. One of the few who still offered help was Coach Henderson. He replayed the decision to call the sheriff's office at 8:15 over and over, wondering if waiting too long had cost precious time. He kept Stephen's spot open at practice, sometimes laying out the boy's glove in the dugout as if he might walk in, late but apologetic. The other players felt the weight. Their season transformed into a ritual. Win or lose, they dedicated each game to number 17. As autumn approached, the landscape itself seemed complicit in the silence. The red clay roads, the tall pines, and the creeks that wound their way toward Mobile Bay, all of them swallowed shouts, erased footprints, and concealed whatever had happened that April night. Searchers returned less frequently, their calls for Stephen fading into the wind. The Johnsons' porch light, however, stayed on, a beacon against the dark, a signal that they had not given up. In December 1978, Detective Torres filed a 47-page report summarizing hundreds of interviews, dozens of searches, and thousands of hours of effort. It concluded nothing. Stephen was not found. No suspect was identified. The report classified the case as ongoing, but in truth, it was slipping into the limbo of unsolved mysteries. For Margaret, the official silence was intolerable. For Thomas, it was confirmation of what he already feared, that their son was gone and the world would not provide an answer. Yet even in this bleakest winter, a seed was planted that would outlast rumor, neglect, and time. The evidence, flawed, contaminated, and incomplete, still existed. The glove, the cleats, the bicycle, with its blood-stained handlebar tape. They were waiting, mute and preserved, for the day science would finally give them a voice. Margaret believed this instinctively. She preserved her flyers, her notes, and her maps because she knew that truth, however delayed, could not be erased. And so the year closed on absence, with a family living in fragments, a community burdened by whispers, and an investigation already losing its momentum. Stephen Michael Johnson had vanished, leaving behind a bicycle, a pair of cleats, and a silence that would not break for nearly 4 decades. By the winter of 1978, the Johnson house on Cottage Hill Road no longer felt like a home, but like a museum of absence. Stephen's room remained frozen in time. Trophies lined neatly on the shelves, his leather jacket draped over the chair, and his glove resting on the desk as though he had just stepped out and would be back to lace it up again. Margaret dusted every surface daily, not because it needed cleaning, but because the act gave her purpose. Thomas, meanwhile, avoided the room entirely. To him, entering it was like reopening a wound that had no hope of healing. The community's focus shifted. At first, Stephen's disappearance was the only subject of conversation. But time has a way of dulling even the sharpest edges of fear. By the spring of 1979, other concerns replaced whispered theories at church coffee hours and football games. New construction projects, rising gas prices, and local elections filled the pages of the Mobile Register. Stephen's photograph, once pinned in every storefront, grew tattered, sun-bleached, or torn down. Margaret replaced them, driving across the county with fresh flyers. But each time the gesture felt heavier, as though she was fighting against not just time, but forgetfulness itself. Gossip, however, did not fade. It evolved. The runaway theory persisted, fueled by those unwilling to accept that violence could touch their community. Others speculated that Stephen had been struck by a car, the driver hiding his body in panic. Darker conversations took place in pool halls and gas station lots, where men muttered about debts, arguments, or predatory impulses. Each rumor carried a fragment of possibility, but none carried proof. For the Johnsons, every whisper was another cut, each theory a rewriting of their son's character, a distortion of who he really was. Margaret learned to smile politely when people offered comfort that sounded like dismissal. Maybe he just needed space, one neighbor told her. Boys his age sometimes do. She thanked them through clenched teeth, then returned to her typewriter, producing more flyers, more letters to local officials, and more pleas to anyone who would listen. For her, grief was action. For Thomas, it was silence. He drove longer routes after work, pushing deeper into the countryside. Headlights illuminating abandoned barns, logging roads, and fishing shacks. He told no one of the hours he spent parked by creeks, staring into the water, hoping for a sign. His grief turned inward, unspoken, a gulf widening between him and his wife even as they shared the same loss. Detective Torres pressed on, methodical as ever. But the limitations of the era weighed heavily. He re-interviewed Mrs. Helen Carvalho, the elderly woman, who lived near Highway 45, and claimed to have heard a car door slam and voices raised on the night Stephen disappeared. Her account was compelling, but uncorroborated. She insisted one voice sounded angry and that she had seen a dark car leaving without headlights. Torres believed her, but without evidence. The tip became another note in his ledger, a possibility without traction. He canvassed auto repair shops, bars, and gas stations, searching for leads. Every inquiry ended the same way: shrugs, vague recollections, or alibis that could neither be proved nor disproved. Other disappearances in the region soon cast Stephen's case in a chilling new light. In the summer of 1979, a college student named Maria vanished after a night class at the university. Her body was never found. A year earlier, in 1976, a high school boy named David had disappeared while walking home from work at a grocery store. Rumors began linking these cases together. Young and athletic, and last seen alone in the evening hours, too many similarities to ignore. Mrs. Elena Murphy, an elderly woman known for her sharp memory, told anyone who would listen that a predator was at work in Mobile County. She connected Stephen's disappearance to Maria's and David's, insisting that the pattern was too precise to be coincidence. The sheriff's office dismissed her theory as speculation, but in whispered conversations, people began to wonder whether their quiet county held a predator who knew how to vanish without leaving evidence. Parents began to forbid their children from walking alone at dusk. Coaches urged players to travel in pairs. What had once been a community defined by familiarity grew edged with suspicion. Everyone knew everyone else, and yet no one knew who to trust. By 1980, Stephen's case was technically open but practically dormant. The sheriff's office, with fewer than 40 officers covering hundreds of square miles, shifted focus to pressing crimes. The file sat on Torres's desk, a weight he carried but could not move. He pushed for state assistance, but the Alabama Bureau of Investigation declined, noting the lack of evidence of foul play. The FBI remained uninterested, citing jurisdiction. The limitations were stark: no DNA testing, no centralized vehicle databases, and no computer networks linking counties. Leads were pursued by hand, one at a time, across a landscape vast and unforgiving. Margaret refused to let the silence win. She became her own investigator, collecting tips, maps, and witness statements. Her Stephen files grew until they consumed Stephen's room, papers stacked on his bed, pinned to his walls, and spread across his desk. She logged every call, every rumor, every story. She became a fixture at the sheriff's office, appearing each Monday morning with fresh notes and questions. Deputies came to respect her determination, even as they struggled to meet her expectations. "She kept that case alive," one later said. "She wouldn't let us forget." But the price was heavy. Margaret and Thomas drifted further apart, each coping in ways the other could not understand. Margaret's relentless public campaign embarrassed Thomas, who feared her intensity alienated potential allies. Thomas's solitary drives frustrated Margaret, who longed for visible partnership. Their dinners grew silent. Their bed grew cold. Their grief, instead of uniting them, carved them into strangers living under the same roof, bound by the same loss but divided by how they bore it. By the early 80s, Stephen's disappearance was no longer front-page news. It had become a cautionary tale, invoked in warnings to teenagers referenced in hushed tones at ball games, but absent from headlines. For the Johnsons, though, time had not dulled anything. Every knock at the door quickened Margaret's pulse. Every phone call, at night, sent Thomas reaching for his keys. Hope remained, but it was hope stretched thin, brittle, and exhausting. They did not know that answers lay buried only miles from their home, in soil that would not be disturbed until a construction project decades later. For now, Stephen remained missing, his case drifting into the cold and the silence of Mobile County carried on. The 80s came to Alabama with the same sweltering summers and brittle winters as before. But for the Johnson family, time did not progress in seasons. It calcified in place. The house on Cottage Hill Road still bore Stephen's presence in every corner. His trophies remained polished, his posters uncurled on the wall, and his letter jacket hung on the back of the chair in his room, never touched by mothballs or storage. Margaret kept the space as a shrine, convinced that preservation was a form of resistance. To erase Stephen's traces would be to admit he was gone forever. Thomas found no solace in the shrine. Each time he passed the closed door of his son's room, he felt the weight of failure pressing down. He had not been able to protect Stephen, had not been able to find him, and had not been able to give Margaret the answers she needed. His grief turned inward, muting his once warm voice into a low murmur. At the shipyard, co-workers noticed he no longer laughed at their jokes or joined them for coffee. At church, he sat stiff in the pew, nodding along with hymns but not singing. Slowly, he became more of a shadow than a presence, fading even as he lived. Margaret's grief burned brighter. She transformed it into action, into advocacy, into persistence that startled even seasoned detectives. By 1982, she had joined a national network of families of the missing, exchanging typed letters with mothers in Missouri, fathers in Pennsylvania, and siblings in Texas. She wrote to senators, urging the creation of better systems for missing persons. She appeared at church halls, schools, and local TV stations, repeating her story with a voice that never wavered, though her hands sometimes shook. "My son is still out there," she declared. "We cannot forget him. We cannot stop looking." The sheriff's office could offer little more than sympathy. With personnel stretched thin and no new evidence, the case file gathered dust. Detective Torres carried it with him for several more years. But as new crimes demanded attention, even he could do little more than hope for a tip or a confession. When he retired in 1985, he passed the thick, worn folder to his successor, Deputy Carl Benson, with a grim warning. "This one will haunt you. Don't let it die." But even Benson, younger and eager, quickly learned how stubborn silence could be. The physical evidence. Stephen's bicycle, the glove, and the cleats remained locked away in evidence storage, mislabeled but not discarded, relics waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. Rumors never stopped. In 1983, a man claimed he had seen Stephen in Florida, working at a diner. Margaret drove 6 hours south, heart hammering with hope, only to find a boy who looked nothing like her son. In 1987, a supposed witness said he'd overheard men talking about a body dumped in the swamps outside Mobile. Deputies drained a stretch of water and came up with nothing but discarded tires and rusted cans. Each false lead cut Margaret deeper, but she never allowed despair to silence her. "If there is one chance in 1,000, she told a reporter in 1989, "I have to take it." Meanwhile, Thomas sank further. He drank more often, sometimes disappearing into the night for hours, returning with mud on his boots and exhaustion etched into his face. Margaret tried to pull him back, but their grief had become two different languages. Where she shouted to the world, he retreated into silence. Where she sought connection, he sought solitude. Their marriage survived, but only in form. They remained bound by their love for Stephen, even as that love expressed itself in opposite ways. The 90s brought new advances in technology and law enforcement tools, but they bypassed Stephen's case. DNA testing was emerging, but the evidence collected in 1978 had not been preserved with those future uses in mind. Fibers were unsealed, biological traces unprotected. Still, Margaret hoped. She lobbied county officials to re-examine the evidence, to reopen the file, and to assign new investigators. Some humored her, some ignored her, but none provided answers. She grew older, her hair silvering, her posture bending slightly, yet her resolve remained unbroken. She typed fewer flyers, now relying on photocopy machines, but her message stayed the same. Stephen is still missing. By 1995, nearly 2 decades had passed. Stephen would have been 35 years old, perhaps married, perhaps with children of his own. Margaret tried not to imagine what his life might have been, but on quiet nights she could not help herself. She pictured him standing tall, coaching Little League, carrying his child on his shoulders. These daydreams were cruel comforts, visions of a life that had been stolen not only from Stephen but from everyone who had loved him. Community memory shifted. Younger generations knew the story only in fragments. The boy who vanished on his way to baseball practice. The mystery their parents whispered about when they warned them not to walk alone. Older residents carried it like a scar still present, still tender, even after years. At church gatherings, Margaret still asked for prayers, her voice steady, though her hands sometimes trembled. Some still joined her in vigils at the field where Stephen had last been expected to appear, standing silently under the lights that now illuminated new generations of players. By the end of the decade, the Johnson family's world had grown smaller. Margaret lived through her advocacy and her relentless pursuit of attention for the case. Thomas receded into himself, speaking less and driving alone more. Their marriage remained intact, but it was a fragile arrangement, held together by habit and by the memory of their son. They had become, in the eyes of their community, symbols of loss, beloved, pitied, and admired in equal measure. And still, the silence persisted. Each year passed with the same unresolved questions, the same unanswered prayers, and the same unhealed wound. The case file remained in the sheriff's office, yellowing at the edges, but intact. The evidence, mishandled but preserved, remained in storage, waiting for the world to catch up. It would take another 20 years before the earth itself broke the silence, before construction crews turned up the truth buried beneath Alabama clay. But in the 80s and 90s, the Johnsons could not know that. All they knew was that their son was gone, and the world had failed to bring him back. The fall of 2015 arrived in southern Alabama with days of sharp sunlight and nights heavy with the scent of pine. Roadwork crews labored outside Mobile, carving new lanes for Highway 45. The job was routine, widening the shoulder, cutting back trees, and reshaping the clay embankments to prepare for asphalt. But on the morning of September 22, just after 9 a.m., a machine operator stopped his excavator mid-swipe. The bucket had dragged through soil that gave up not just red clay, but fragments of something pale, something that didn't belong. At first, the crew thought it might be animal remains. But then, a blue scrap of fabric caught the light, tangled in the disturbed soil. The operator climbed down, brushed at it with gloved hands, and froze. What emerged wasn't random bone. It was unmistakably human. He shouted for the foreman, who radioed for law enforcement. Within an hour, the site was cordoned off, machinery silenced, and workers were standing in stunned silence as deputies rolled yellow tape across the ditches. The sheriff's office dispatched their crime scene unit, joined quickly by investigators from the Alabama Bureau of Investigation. The first photographs captured fragments of bone, tattered cloth, and the faint outline of a shallow grave that had been carved into clay nearly 40 years earlier. The medical examiner's office arrived with tents and evidence bags, treating the roadside like sacred ground. Word traveled fast. Local news vans pulled up. Cameras pointed toward the tape, speculating on what the crew had unearthed. By late afternoon, the discovery was already being linked to the county's most enduring mystery, the disappearance of 18-year-old Stephen Michael Johnson in 1978. It was only miles from where his bicycle had been found. For deputies who had heard the story from retired colleagues, the realization carried a chill. Could this finally be him? Forensic excavation is a slow process, governed by patience and precision. Over the next week, investigators sifted through the soil layer by layer, recovering fragments that told a story long buried: bones, clothing remnants, and the corroded frame of a wallet. Inside, though paper had dissolved into pulp, one item had survived: a class ring, the band tarnished, but the initials still legible: SMJ. A symbol once worn proudly by a boy pedaling toward practice. Now it emerged from the earth as a silent witness. DNA testing had advanced far beyond what detectives in 1978 could have imagined. Samples taken from the remains were compared against a cheek swab voluntarily provided by Stephen's surviving sister. Within weeks, the confirmation arrived. The remains were indeed Stephen Michael Johnson. The boy who had vanished on a spring evening had been there all along, buried beneath the soil of the county he had called home. The sheriff's office called a press conference. Cameras framed the sheriff at a podium, a photograph of Stephen propped beside him, the same school portrait his mother had carried into that office decades earlier. We can confirm today that the remains recovered on Highway 45 are those of Stephen Johnson, missing since 1978, the sheriff announced. This is no longer a disappearance. This is a homicide investigation. For Margaret Johnson, the news was both a wound and a balm. After 37 years of searching, of hoping, of imagining her son alive in distant places, she finally had an answer. Stephen had not run away. He had not chosen to leave. He had been taken, silenced, hidden in the clay. The confirmation stripped away false hope, but also erased cruel speculation. Her boy had been murdered, and someone still alive had carried that secret all these years. Thomas did not live to hear it. He had passed away in 2011, his heart failing after decades of wear. Margaret carried the news alone, clutching the phone when detectives called, her hands trembling as tears blurred her vision. She whispered her husband's name, telling him in absent prayer that their search was over, that Stephen had been found. The case file, long dormant, came alive again. Detectives reopened every page, every photograph, every forgotten note. Evidence that had once seemed useless gained new significance in light of the grave. The location was not random. It was along a stretch of road known mainly to locals, a place concealed by thickets of pine and rarely visited. Whoever had buried Stephen had chosen the spot carefully, close enough to where he vanished to avoid suspicion, yet remote enough that discovery would take decades. Forensic experts re-examined the bicycle, glove, and cleats, preserved in boxes now brittle with age. Under modern microscopes, fibers and residues that once told no story began to whisper. Soil analysis linked trace particles to the same clay composition as the burial site. Tire impressions, photographed but ignored in 1978, were reanalyzed with digital enhancement. They pointed not to a random passerby, but to a specific kind of truck common in the county at the time, narrowing the suspect pool. The sheriff's office announced they would form a cold case task force, bringing in state investigators and forensic specialists to work alongside local deputies. The press coverage intensified. Headlines across Alabama carried Stephen's name again, decades after it had faded from print. Community members who had been teenagers in 1978 found themselves back under questioning, asked to recall where they were, who they saw, and what they remembered. Memory, fragile as it was, became evidence. And in those memories, investigators began to sense a pattern. Not all silence was equal. Some people spoke too quickly and too vaguely, as if rehearsing. Some declined to be interviewed at all. One name surfaced more than once, buried in old witness statements, overlooked in the original investigation. The discovery of the grave transformed that name from footnote to prime suspect. For Margaret, the revelation that Stephen had been found meant vigils no longer carried the ache of uncertainty. She still lit candles and still placed flowers at the old ball field. But now she whispered not for return, but for justice. Her son had been hidden in the soil for 37 years, but he had not been forgotten. And now, for the first time since 1978, there was hope, not of recovery, but of accountability. The grave had given back what silence had stolen. The community braced for what came next. An investigation that would pierce decades of denial, uncover betrayals, and end with a name spoken aloud in a courtroom. A name no one expected. The remains had been recovered, the DNA confirmed, and the Johnson family finally knew where Stephen's life had ended. But the discovery of a grave was only the beginning. For investigators, the real work was to answer the question that had lingered since 1978. Who put him there? The cold case task force worked like archaeologists of both soil and memory. They reopened every witness interview, scanned fragile photographs, and entered the old paper notes into digital systems where patterns could be traced more efficiently. What had once been a jumble of anecdotes and hunches became a map, and on that map, one name surfaced again and again. Not in bold letters, not in confessions, but in whispers, contradictions, and small evasions. The name belonged to a man who had been there in 1978, part of the search parties, a neighbor who had helped haul brush and shine flashlights through the pine woods. He had been younger then, broad-shouldered, working shifts at a local mill. People remembered him as helpful, if a little quiet. His name appeared on the volunteer sign-in sheets from the first week after Stephen vanished. He had even offered condolences to the Johnsons, standing on their porch with a casserole dish his wife had made. And then, like everyone else, he had moved on with his life. But when investigators compared old witness accounts, inconsistencies emerged. Back in 1978, he claimed to have seen Stephen riding his bicycle near the mill. Yet another neighbor swore Stephen had never passed that way. In 1981, during a follow-up interview, he changed his story, saying he'd seen a boy on a bike, but couldn't be sure it was Stephen. Decades later, when detectives asked again, his recollection shrank even further. Memory fades, yes, but the pattern of retreat stood out. Forensic analysis added weight. The soil clinging to Stephen's cleats, stored for nearly 4 decades, was compared against modern samples from the burial site. The composition matched. More tellingly, microscopic metal shavings found in the fibers of Stephen's backpack aligned with shavings commonly produced at the very mill where this man had worked in 1978. It was a detail impossible to stage or explain away. Detectives began surveillance quietly. They followed him as he walked his dog in the mornings, noted his routines at the grocery store, and studied the way neighbors waved politely but never lingered in conversation. He was now in his late 60s, retired, his hair white and thinning. He had lived in the county all his life, never drawing suspicion, never moving away. Evil, investigators realized, had not fled. It had settled in, growing old among them. In November 2016, the sheriff called a press briefing. The room filled with reporters, many of whom hadn't even been born when Stephen vanished. The sheriff spoke carefully, his voice steady. "We have made an arrest in connection with the 1,978 disappearance and death of Stephen Johnson." Cameras clicked furiously as the name was read aloud. A name familiar to the community. A name that made jaws clench and heads shake. Neighbors struggled to reconcile it. They remembered him mowing his lawn, handing out candy at Halloween, and working beside them in church committees. One woman whispered to a reporter, "I let my children play in his yard." Another muttered, "He searched with us. He stood right there with a flashlight." The arrest itself was quiet. Detectives approached his modest brick home before dawn, lights off, voices low. He opened the door in pajamas, blinking at the sight of deputies in ballistic vests. When they read the charges, murder, kidnapping, and concealment of a body, he didn't argue. He simply asked for his shoes. Some officers expected outrage or denial. Instead, they were met with silence. The silence of a man who had carried something for nearly 4 decades and now seemed too tired to fight it anymore. The booking photographs spread quickly across local news, then national outlets. There he was, older now, face lined, eyes unreadable. For those who remembered him in 1978, the transformation was jarring. The helpful neighbor had become the accused killer. And with the image came a deeper reckoning. The idea that someone could live among them for nearly 40 years, hiding a crime in plain sight. For Margaret Johnson, the news arrived by phone. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the wood grain as the detective's words poured into her ear. They had a suspect. They had arrested him. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady her breath. Relief mingled with fresh grief. "Why?" she whispered. The question no one could yet answer. Community reaction split between shock and grim recognition. Some insisted they'd always felt uneasy around him. Others defended him, saying it had to be a mistake. Old photographs surfaced in scrapbooks and yearbooks. Him at a barbecue, him holding a fishing pole, and him in the background of search party snapshots. Each image became a piece of evidence, a reminder that ordinary faces can conceal unfathomable truths. The investigation deepened after the arrest. Search warrants were executed on his property. Detectives dug through tool sheds, old vehicles, and crawl spaces. They seized boxes of personal items, maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings about Stephen's disappearance. In one drawer, they found a pocket knife with initials carved faintly into the handle. In another, an old set of keys that Margaret swore looked like the set Stephen had carried. Forensic testing would determine their origin, but the symbolism was undeniable. The community reeled. Churches held vigils. Former teammates of Stephen, now middle-aged with children of their own, gathered at the baseball field, lighting candles under the scoreboard. They spoke about how their friend had vanished at 18, how his absence had shadowed their lives, and how the arrest felt like both an ending and a reopening of wounds. The story spread beyond Alabama, picked up by national outlets that framed it as a triumph of persistence and science. Cold case breakthrough after 37 years. The headlines read, but for those in the county, it wasn't triumph. It was betrayal. It was realizing that someone they had shared pews with, someone who had offered casseroles, someone who had stood shoulder to shoulder in search lines, had been the very person they were searching for. As the suspect sat in jail awaiting trial, Margaret prepared herself for the courtroom. She had lived 37 years without knowing the truth. Now she would face the man accused of stealing her son. The arrest had stunned the community, but the trial would force them all to relive 1978, not as rumor, not as mystery, but as testimony, evidence, and judgment. The courthouse in downtown Mobile stood as it always had, its pale stone columns weathered by Gulf winds and decades of trials, both forgotten and legendary. But on the first morning of the trial, those steps were crowded with news vans, photographers, and townspeople who had followed every twist since the arrest. For many, this was not just a trial. It was the reopening of a wound they had carried for nearly 40 years. Inside, the courtroom filled with a charged quiet. Former classmates of Stephen Johnson sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had never known him, drawn by the weight of history. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked outside, and the scent of old wood mixed with the faint tang of polished marble. The front row was reserved for Margaret Johnson, now in her 70s, but still carrying herself with the poise of a mother who had made a vow never to let her son's story fade. The defendant entered in shackles, dressed in a plain suit provided by the court. He was older now, nearly unrecognizable from the photographs of a young mechanic in 1978. His hair was thin, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes scanned the room with the same flatness that had unsettled detectives during interrogation. When Margaret's gaze met his, it was unwavering. She had waited too long to look away now. The prosecution opened with deliberate precision. The district attorney laid out the timeline. An 18-year-old boy disappeared on a spring evening in 1978. A bicycle was found twisted in a ditch, a glove, cleats, and silence. Decades of rumors and false leads. A grave uncovered in 2015. And finally, DNA evidence that placed the defendant in contact with Stephen at the time of his death. The attorney's voice rose just enough on the words "buried face down, hands bound," sending a shiver across the gallery. Defense counsel countered by reminding jurors of the time gap. 37 years, he said, drawing out each syllable. Memories fade, evidence degrades. This man has lived an upright life since then. Do not let suspicion harden into certainty. He gestured toward the defendant, painting him as an old man, incapable of such violence, a man who had worked, paid taxes, and attended church like any other citizen. The defense's strategy was clear. Sow doubt in the cracks left by time. The state's case unfolded slowly, like threads being pulled together into a tapestry. Forensic experts testified first. The DNA analyst described how hair fibers recovered from Stephen's equipment bag had yielded a full genetic profile. Charts and graphs were projected on screens for the jury, lines of colored peaks matching perfectly with the defendant's DNA. It is not a possibility, the expert said firmly. It is a certainty. Next came the anthropologist, who spoke about the condition of the remains. Her testimony was clinical but haunting. The fractures in the skull were consistent with blunt force trauma, the shallow grave, and the evidence that the body had been hastily covered. These injuries, she explained, were not accidental. They are deliberate, inflicted by another human being. Then came the testimony that silenced even the shuffle of papers in the courtroom. Excerpts from the defendant's own recorded confession. Detectives had pressed play, and the jury listened as his voice filled the room, calm, almost mechanical, as he described how Stephen had stopped by his shop with a loose chain on his bicycle, how a conversation had turned to argument, and how, in his own words, "I snapped." He admitted striking the boy, admitted burying him in the woods, and admitted scattering his belongings to make it look like an accident. Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared down at their notepads, as if the words might burn if looked at directly. For Margaret, hearing it aloud was both vindication and devastation. She gripped the edges of the wooden pew, her knuckles white as tears welled in her eyes. The truth had always been the only thing she sought. Now, hearing it in his own voice, she realized truth was heavier than she could have imagined. The defense attempted to soften the impact. They argued the confession had been the ramblings of an old man, coerced by investigators, shaped by guilt and fading memory. They brought in a psychologist, who suggested post-traumatic stress from military service had left the defendant unstable and prone to false admissions. But the jury had heard the details, the kind only the killer could have known. Witnesses from 1978 followed. Neighbors who remembered the defendant offering to examine Stephen's bicycle. A woman who recalled hearing a car door slam and voices raised near the place the bicycle was found. Even the old coach, his voice thick with age, took the stand to recall the night his star pitcher failed to arrive for practice. Each testimony painted not just a timeline but a portrait of absence, the ripple of one boy's disappearance across an entire town. Then, in one of the most anticipated moments of the trial, Margaret Johnson was called to the stand. She rose slowly, clutching her handbag, and swore the oath with steady hands. Facing the jury, she told them about her son, the boy who whistled when he rode his bike, who kissed her cheek before leaving for practice, who had dreams bigger than Mobile County. Her voice did not falter when she turned toward the defendant. "You left me wondering for 37 years. You buried more than a body. You buried my life. But today, the truth is uncovered." The courtroom was silent as she stepped down. Reporters wrote furiously, some wiping at their eyes. Jurors looked stricken. In that moment, the case was no longer about charts or fibers or timelines. It was about a mother, her son, and a community betrayed by someone who had hidden among them. As closing arguments approached, the tension in the courtroom sharpened. The prosecution urged the jury not to be distracted by the years that had passed. "Time does not erase guilt," the attorney said. "It only delays justice. Do not let delay be denial." The defense urged compassion, reminding jurors that the accused was now an old man who posed no threat. But the question was not about age, it was about accountability. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled for the first time in days. Margaret sat silently, her hands folded, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand, where her son's story had finally been told in full. The trial was almost over. The judgment was near. The jury deliberated for less than a day, but for those waiting outside the heavy wooden doors, it felt like another lifetime. Reporters loitered in the hallway, trading whispers. Family members and former classmates clutched each other's hands. Margaret Johnson sat quietly in the front row of the gallery, a small folded photograph of her son in her lap. She had carried that picture to every vigil, every meeting with detectives, and every prayer service. Today it felt like Stephen himself was in the room, waiting for his name to be spoken. When the jury filed back in, the air thickened. 12 faces, unreadable, took their seats. The foreman stood, a folded slip of paper trembling slightly in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The words echoed across the chamber, filling the silence with finality. Margaret pressed the photograph to her chest. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of surprise. She had expected this moment of release, as though years of unanswered questions had finally exhaled from her body. Gasps rose from the gallery. Some spectators wept openly, others simply shook their heads. The defendant showed little reaction. He sat motionless, eyes forward, as if the words belonged to someone else. For decades, he had managed to exist in the community as a mechanic, a neighbor, and a volunteer. Now, stripped of pretense, he was a convicted murderer, the man who had robbed an 18-year-old of a future and a family of peace. The judge, an experienced jurist with decades on the bench, looked over her glasses at the defendant. "This community has lived under a shadow since 1978, she said. The shadow of a question without an answer. Today that shadow lifts, not because the loss is healed, but because truth has been named." She sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck once, and the trial was over. For Margaret, the moment was surreal. She had lived nearly 4 decades chasing answers, building files, pressing detectives, and telling and retelling Stephen's story to anyone who would listen. Now the verdict was entered, the sentence delivered, and the story closed in the eyes of the law. She closed her eyes and whispered, "We did it, Stephen. We found you." Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. Reporters clamored for comment. Margaret spoke briefly, her voice steady. "Justice does not erase grief, but justice matters. My son mattered, and now the world knows what was hidden all these years." Her words traveled across television screens and newspapers, reaching far beyond Alabama, resonating with families still waiting for their own answers in unsolved cases. Community reaction was mixed, layered with sorrow and disbelief. Some neighbors admitted they had long harbored suspicions. Others were stunned, unable to reconcile the quiet man they knew with the brutality described in court. A local pastor addressed his congregation that Sunday. "We must accept that evil can wear the face of the familiar, but we must also accept that truth, though delayed, still has the power to break silence." In the weeks following the sentencing, former classmates of Stephen organized a memorial at the baseball field, where he had once pitched with such promise. They wore shirts with his number stitched on the sleeves, gathered under the lights that had first illuminated his talent. One by one, they shared memories. His easy grin on the mound, his habit of cracking jokes in the dugout, and the way he could turn any moment into a competition just for fun. They released balloons into the night sky, each carrying a handwritten note to the friend who had vanished but had never been forgotten. At the prison intake facility, the defendant was processed like any other inmate. Fingerprints, mugshots, a number replacing his name. For decades, he had walked free, eaten meals at his own kitchen table, and driven the same county roads he had once used to carry out his crime. Now steel bars and locked doors defined the boundaries of his world. He spoke little to guards or fellow inmates, spending long hours in silence. For a man who had carried a secret for so long, perhaps the quiet was familiar. Detective Michael Santos, who had led the final phase of the case, spoke candidly to reporters. "It is rare," he admitted, "to see a case span nearly 4 decades and still arrive at truth. This outcome is a testament to the persistence of families, of investigators, and of science that didn't exist in 1978. Justice delayed, yes, but not denied." His words echoed what many in the community felt: relief, tempered by the bitter knowledge that Stephen's life could not be restored. For Margaret, the aftermath brought a strange kind of emptiness. For 37 years, her days had been defined by searching for and organizing flyers, attending meetings, and calling detectives. Now, there were no more tasks, no more leads to chase. The silence in her home felt different, less frantic, but no less heavy. Friends encouraged her to rest, to grieve without the burden of investigation. She nodded politely, but confided to a close friend, "I don't know who I am without the search." And yet, in small ways, healing began. Letters poured in from across the country from other families of the missing, strangers moved by her perseverance, and young people inspired by Stephen's story. Margaret responded to many of them, her careful handwriting filling page after page. She began to think of her role not as ending, but as transforming, from a mother searching for her son to an advocate helping others search for theirs. In Mobile County, the case became a touchstone. Law enforcement agencies used it as a training example, teaching recruits about the importance of preserving evidence, listening to families, and never dismissing a missing person as a runaway. Local journalists revisited the decades of coverage, reflecting on how narratives of rumor and speculation had obscured the truth. Teachers at Murphy High School told Stephen's story to students as a lesson in resilience, in injustice, and in remembering. The verdict had been read, the sentence imposed, but the echo of Stephen Johnson's disappearance and rediscovery lingered. It lingered in the cracked asphalt of the road where his bicycle was found, in the trees that had grown tall over the grave where he lay, and in the courtroom where his mother spoke his name with unwavering strength. And it lingered in the collective memory of a community that would never again mistake silence for safety. Autumn returned to Alabama with its heavy skies and the scent of wood smoke drifting through neighborhoods where the past clung as firmly as moss to old brick. Years had passed since the trial, but in Mobile County, the story of Stephen Johnson had never faded. His photograph still hung in the high school trophy case, his number still stitched into jerseys at local games, and his name still whispered whenever parents reminded their children to ride in pairs and never take the long way home. For Margaret Johnson, life became quieter but not smaller. She had traded flyers for letters, her files of witness statements for folders of correspondence from strangers across the country. Families of other missing sons and daughters wrote to her, some still waiting decades later for the call she had finally received. Margaret answered each letter by hand, her script neat and deliberate. "Do not give up," she would write. "Evidence waits. Truth waits. Time does not erase what is hidden. It only delays its uncovering." Her words carried the authority of someone who had lived the endless wait and seen the miracle of its ending. On the 39th anniversary of Stephen's disappearance, a small group gathered at the baseball field where he had last been expected. The grass had been freshly cut, the infield raked, and the scoreboard lit against the dusk. Former teammates, now gray at the temples, stood beside current players who knew Stephen only through stories. Margaret sat in the front row of the bleachers, her hands folded in her lap. The coach, older now, leaned on a cane as he spoke. "Every pitch here carries his shadow," he said. "Every cheer, every silence, every inning belongs partly to him." They released lanterns into the darkening sky, their glow drifting upward like fragile prayers. Margaret's most private ritual, though, took place far from crowds. Once a month she visited the place where Stephen had been buried for so many years in silence. The site had been cleared and marked with a modest stone, its surface carved simply with his name, his birth and death years, and the words "beloved son," forever remembered. The pine trees still towered nearby, their roots curling deep into the soil that had hidden truth for decades. Margaret would sit on a folding chair she brought herself, listening to the wind in the branches. Sometimes she spoke aloud, telling Stephen about the people who still remembered him. Other times, she simply closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the forest fill the space between memory and presence. The community, too, sought symbols of closure. A mural appeared on the side of an old brick building downtown of Stephen, in his baseball uniform, smiling, the caption reading, "Justice after 37 years. Never forgotten." School children traced the outlines of his face with their fingers, asking their parents who he was. The answers became lessons in resilience, in patience, and in the way truth has a stubborn habit of surfacing, even after decades of silence. Law enforcement adopted the case as both warning and inspiration. Cadets were taught about the missteps of 1978, the trampled scene, the lost evidence, the flawed reports, and how those mistakes had shadowed the case for decades. But they were also taught about the perseverance of a mother who refused to let go and the power of modern science to breathe life into old evidence. "Every cold case," one instructor told recruits, "isn't cold, it's waiting. And waiting isn't the same as forgetting." For those who had once doubted, who had whispered theories of runaways or reckless choices, the truth forced a reckoning. They saw in the verdict not only guilt confirmed, but also the fragility of memory and the ease with which communities sometimes turn doubt upon the grieving instead of the guilty. In church basements and coffee shops, people admitted their shame at having believed rumors. They spoke softly of learning to listen differently, to honor the testimony of those who knew their loved ones best. As years continued to pass, Margaret aged with dignity, her steps slower, but her resolve unchanged. She carried her son's story into public forums, urging lawmakers to fund cold case units, pressing communities to preserve evidence, and reminding anyone who would listen that time is never the enemy. Silence is. When asked once why she had never stopped searching, she answered with a steady voice, "Because my son was still out there, and because love does not stop at the edge of doubt." The epilogue of Stephen Johnson's story is not one of triumph, but of resolution. It is the story of a truth unearthed after being buried in both soil and silence for nearly 4 decades. It is the story of a community stunned by the revelation that the face of evil can be ordinary, familiar, even helpful. And it is the story of a mother who became the keeper of memory until the system, the science, and the passage of time finally caught up with what she had known all along, that her son's life mattered and his story deserved an ending. On evenings when the sky darkened early and the cicadas sang their restless chorus, Margaret sometimes returned to the baseball field. She would stand near the pitcher's mound, close her eyes, and imagine the sound of a ball striking leather, the echo of cheers, and the sight of her son winding up for a pitch. In those moments, memory and presence blurred, and for just a heartbeat, the years folded in on themselves. She could almost hear him whistle, could almost see him pedaling home through the twilight, his smile quick and sure. Justice had come late, but it had come, and the story, once buried, now lived in the open air, etched in memory, carved in stone, carried in the hearts of all who had waited with her. If you want to hear more stories of families who refused to let silence win, of cold cases cracked by persistence and science, and of justice clawed back from decades of doubt, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Because every case deserves a voice, every family deserves answers, and every story deserves to be told.